is leaving the door open for a possible change, whether that's a deferral or a dumping of the policy altogether. We will have to wait and see. So it is in that context that the two former Prime Ministers have intervened today in the debate to warned the government really against any such moves. Paul Keating, who introduced compulsory super back in 1993 when he was the Prime Minister at the time, said that the super guarantee is legislated to rise by 2.5% over coming years, which is effectively, in his words, a wage rise for Australians. And given that wages haven't increased over the past 8 years in real terms, he says that if the government moves to change this legislated super guarantee increase, well, then they'll also be robbing the workers of Australia of a wage increase that would help their retirement savings. So here is what both Paul Keating and Kevin Rudd had to say today.
So under the cowardly talk of the COVID crisis, they want to gyp ordinary people by 2.5% of their income for the rest of their life. You've got to understand this, 2.5% super is for the rest of your life. So if they knock off the 2.5%, all these scaly Liberals, aided and abetted by the Treasurer, people lose the 2.5% for the rest of their working lives.
They say that if we go ahead with increasing the superannuation guarantee level from 9.5% to 10 to 10.5 to 11 to 11.5 to 12 in the years that are to come, that will somehow depress natural wages growth in the Australian economy. Pigs might fly. That is the biggest bullshit argument I have ever heard against going ahead with decent provision for people's superannuation savings for the future.
So, Jane, in Parliament today, the government's handling of the aged care sector during the COVID-19 crisis has continued to dominate debate.
Yeah, it sure has, Karina. And the government had some good news on that front. It has basically extended the emergency spending it's committed to the aged care sector during the COVID-19 crisis for another 6 months. So the $1 billion that has already been spent will now increase to $1.5 billion between now and March. I mean, this really shows that the COVID crisis is nowhere near over. But this funding will help facilities, help aged care homes actually buy enough personal protective equipment. It'll help them retain staff, and it'll also provide payments to staff to ensure they don't have to work across multiple facilities, which is one of the key problems identified during the Victorian outbreak. But as far as the government's performance is concerned, well, Labor is continuing to hammer the coalition. The Labor leader Anthony Albanese devoted most questions in question time today. He even raised the infamous kerosene baths incident that the former aged care minister Bronwyn Bishop presided to under her watch. Mr Albanese was asking Scott Morrison if she was sacked over that scandal. Why hasn't Richard Colbeck been sacked over his handling of aged care? And of course, we know that during this crisis, thousands of residents and workers have been infected with COVID-19 and hundreds of aged care residents have tragically died. For his part, though, Richard Colbeck is continuing to defend his handling, and he's told reporters he hasn't even considered resigning. Here's what he had to say.
We're putting all of our effort together to ensure that we can provide appropriate service for all residents in residential aged care together, because we need the public health system in Victoria working with the residential aged care system in Victoria to do that.
Hold on.
No, I haven't considered my resignation.
Richard Colbeck there saying he hasn't considered his resignation despite mounting pressure from the opposition. And Karina, at this stage, the Prime Minister is standing by his aged care minister.
Jane Norman reporting from Canberra. Tonight's Q&A program is drawing on the wisdom of some highly respected Australians to ask how they think we should be dealing with the big issues during the pandemic. Host Hamish McDonald joins me now in the studio.
Hi,
Hamish,
Karina.
this is a follow-up to last week's program where you had a youth panel on. Tonight's all about wisdom. Who's on there?
Kerry O'Brien, very familiar to ABC viewers. Colin Barnett, the former Premier of Western Australia. Gillian Broadbent, who sits on the Woolies board. She's the Chancellor of the University of Wollongong, also former Reserve Bank board member. Ronnie Khan, who does Oz Harvest. I don't know if you've come across her work before, but an incredible Australian that has made sure that food gets to people who need it, and they've had demand on their services like never before during this pandemic. And Ray Minikin, who's an Indigenous pastor who's just an incredible mind, a great thinker, a generous soul and spirit. So he'll be bringing a very good portion of wisdom tonight.
And so what are the topics? Is aged care going to feature heavily?
Yeah, there's a bit of stuff about aged care, but I think also it's interesting. A lot of people seem to have philosophical questions. I think this time has made us all reflect a little bit on what it is we miss, what it is that brings us together, what it is that divides us. This is a bit about happiness and hope and where you can draw that from during tough times. And I think it's really interesting with all of these people. You know, they're all individuals who've gone through a great deal of struggle in their life in one shape or another. They know how to fight. They know how to come back from a crisis. And I think they all in their own way know how to teach, which is, I think, another thing that we're all kind of looking for in some degree at the moment.
Is it going to be strictly about the pandemic? Because I note that the former West Australian Premier Colin Barnett, last week, he came out quite strongly about the new federal laws that have been proposed to regulate agreements between state and territory governments and public universities with foreign countries.
He's got a huge amount to say about that. He says the way Western Australia views China is very different to the way the federal government, in fact, the rest of Australia views China. He says WA is more embedded in Asia, in the Asian market than any other. If you think about China as a big market for Australia, well, for Western Australia, proportionally, it's even bigger. He said the difference between a state and a federal government is that the states often are the ones that own the assets that are being sold as commodities. So they're both political and they have political negotiations, but they also have commercial negotiations in a way that the federal government might not. He's got a unique perspective on that. He's got a lot to say about gas-led recoveries, a lot to say about pipelines between the states, a huge amount to say about the relationship, in fact, between the federal government and the states altogether. He makes the point that actually, for all this talk of the federal government doing well during the pandemic, bringing together this national cabinet, he actually brings an alternative argument. He says that this whole process, the National Cabinet, has shown the weakness of federal government, the impotency of federal government. And then, in fact, at the moment it is the states and the state-based health authorities that are running the show, and that in the face of that, in the face of closed borders, there's very little that the federal government, or as he points out, Clive Palmer, can do.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear his thoughts on hard border closures. Hamish, thanks so much.
Thanks.
And you can catch Q&A tonight at 9:35 p.m. Eastern on ABC TV and on iView. The interim report into last summer's devastating bushfire season has been released. It calls for more oversight at the federal level and stresses the importance of a national warning system, which is currently under development. Reporter Anna Henderson has more.
I think the main thing that is clear from this document is that the Royal Commissioners are taking a very collaborative approach to how they're dealing with these questions ahead of the next fire season. Much of the discussion in this 25-page document is about how things can be improved, but there certainly don't appear to be many barbs. There don't appear to be many strong criticisms in terms of how things operated in the last season. And we knew that was going to be the case because during the course of the 30 days of Royal Commission hearings, we had commissioners say that this was not a finger-pointing exercise. At the core of what the government wanted to have addressed in this Royal Commission was how the different governments can work together to deal with a national natural disaster. And so the key takeaway really from the document so far is that there does need to be better coordination and more consideration of whether or not the federal government should have the power under legislation to declare a state of emergency in the future. This is all about raising the initial issues that need to be potentially considered before the next fire season. And we know that fire season is already underway in some parts of the country. There was discussion in this document about prioritising the national warning system for bushfires and any changes that need to be made to that. We did hear during the course of the evidence that a number of people raised concerns about whether or not the watch and act warning system or that level of alert was problem. People didn't understand what to do when they were told to both watch and act. It seemed like two different directions were being given. So that's one thing that certainly the Royal Commissioners are urging the emergency services and levels of government to come to agreement on soon. The final report was actually due today. It was then the case that the Royal Commissioners asked for more time, and there's an extraordinary amount of evidence still for them to go through before they do prepare that final report by the end of October. At this point, though, I think there's certainly things to consider in this. One of the recommendations does relate to whether or not the National Cabinet process that was set up to deal with coronavirus should be extended to deal with natural disasters. And we know, in fact, that that's really already the case, that National Cabinet has pretty much replaced the COAG process and will continue in that way. But I think what's crucial here in this document is the need for that National Cabinet approach to be those regular meetings and discussions as opposed to irregular meetings or not having the chance for those face-to-face talks between the leaders to make those crucial decisions.
China has confirmed yet another investigation into Australian wine. The one-year anti-subsidy probe will apply to wine in containers of 2 litres or less. It comes 2 weeks after a separate year-long investigation was launched for alleged dumping, which the Australian wine industry has rejected as baseless. China correspondent Bill Birtles has the details.
Last time China's Commerce Ministry announced an anti-dumping investigation, this time it's anti-subsidies, which is also called countervailing duties in the trade lingo. But the thing is, the wine industry and the Australian government were briefed during the initial investigation announcement that this subsidy probe would also be announced. So the difference this time is earlier this month, a few weeks ago, when the dumping investigation was announced, we saw a massive plunge in the share price of Treasury Wine Estates, the company that exports the most Australian wine to China. This time around, we haven't seen much of a shock at all because both the industry and the Australian government were well and truly expecting this.
And how likely is it that the investigation will result in tariffs?
Well, last time the Chinese government launched a year-long anti-subsidy investigation, it was on barley exports, and that resulted with the Chinese government claiming that Australian barley exports were subsidised, and Beijing ended up slapping an 80.5% tariff on barley exports, which effectively killed the Australian trade into China. So it's very worrying that you have two separate but very similar investigations into Australian wine exports. Last time around, when the Chinese government talked about this dumping issue, many in the wine industry in Australia and also the Trade Minister Simon Birmingham believe that there is no basis for the Chinese claim that Australian wine has been dumped in this market. So this time around, it's probably the same. We already heard the Minister this morning say that there is no basis to claims that various research and development programs that the Australian government runs for the industry, that those constitute subsidies. So Mr Birmingham did say today that Australia, with the Australian government, with the industry, will mount a robust defence of Australian wine exports to China. But of course, Karina, everybody suspects that politics is really at play with the announcement of these investigations.
Yeah, so explain a little bit more about what China's motivation in launching this series of strikes on Australian exports could be.
Well, even though China's government officially denies any links between the worsening diplomatic relationship with Australia and this series of trade investigations, whether it's barley, now wine, we've also had the suspension of some beef exports, even though there is an official denial that they are linked, it always appears to me that the Chinese government puts in the bare minimum effort to deny that they're linked. Quite often, officials or the state media will say there's no link, but, and then they will happily raise the various areas that could be targeted next, and wine for quite some time has been foreshadowed as a potential target.
The US city of Portland has been rocked by another night of protests.